There was a time when empires were built with soldiers, ships, and steel. Territory was claimed through conquest. Wealth was seized through taxation. Power was measured in land controlled, and enemies defeated. But something changed. Because today, the most powerful empires on Earth don't need to invade anyone. They don't need to fire a single shot. They don't even need to exist on a map. And yet, they can influence governments, shape national policies, determine economic outcomes, and quietly extract wealth from entire populations year after year, decade after decade. Not through war, but through debt. So here's the mystery. How did borrowing money become more powerful than conquering land? And when did debt stop being a financial tool and start becoming the invisible engine of empire? Setting the stage. Before debt ruled the world in the earliest economies, money had limits. Kings could tax their people. They could mint coins from gold or silver. But their spending power was tied directly to what they physically possessed. If they ran out of gold, they ran out of options, which meant war was expensive. Infrastructure was expensive. Expansion was expensive. And eventually rulers realized something dangerous. They didn't need more gold. They needed access to future gold. This is where the logic of borrowing began to shift from temporary solution to permanent strategy. Instead of waiting years to accumulate wealth through taxes, governments could simply borrow against their future tax revenue. And suddenly, spending was no longer constrained by reality. It was constrained by confidence. If lenders believed a government would exist long enough to repay its debts, they would lend vast sums of money today, which meant states could now fund wars, build fleets, and expand influence immediately while passing the cost on to future generations. Debt had quietly turned time into a weapon. Origins: war credit. In the birth of financial power, the earliest large-scale government borrowing was almost always tied to conflict. Wars required immediate funding, but tax collection took time. So rulers began issuing bonds, promises to repay lenders later, with interest. At first, this seemed harmless. Merchants financed governments. Governments repaid merchants. But then a new class of power emerged, those who didn't rule territory but financed those who did. These financiers discovered something critical. They didn't need to win wars. They just needed to fund them. Because no matter who won on the battlefield, the debt still had to be repaid. And repayment meant influence. Influence over taxes. Influence over trade. Influence over policy. The creditor didn't need an army because the debtor already had one. Rise. The institutionalization of debt over time, borrowing stopped being a temporary emergency measure. It became a permanent feature of governance. Governments rolled over old debts into new ones. Interest payments became routine budget items. National debt grew from a short-term necessity into a long-term system. And then came the real turning point. Debt became tradable. Government bonds could now be bought and sold on financial markets, which meant debt itself became an asset, an investment, a commodity. Now, funding a government wasn't just patriotic, it was profitable. Financial institutions could earn steady returns simply by lending to the state. And the larger the debt grew, the larger the market became. So instead of resisting government borrowing, markets began to depend on it. The incentives had flipped. Debt was no longer a burden to be minimized. It was a product to be expanded. Breaking point. When money changed meaning as borrowing expanded, another quiet transformation occurred. Money itself began to change. Instead of being backed by physical commodities like gold or silver, currency became increasingly tied to government promises. Promises to repay bonds. Promises to honor obligations. Promises to maintain value. In other words, money was no longer a thing. It was a claim. A claim on future productivity. A claim on future taxation. A claim on future economic output. Which meant the entire monetary system now rested on something intangible. Trust that the debt would be repaid. But here sat the problem. Total debt began to grow faster than the economy needed to repay it. Governments borrowed more to service existing obligations. Central banks intervened to stabilize markets. New currency entered circulation not because new wealth had been created, but because new liabilities had been issued. Debt was now generating money. Money was now generating more debt. Fallout. The self-reinforcing loop. Once debt became foundational to the monetary system, it could no longer be easily reduced, because reducing debt meant reducing financial assets, reducing liquidity, reducing growth. Economic slowdowns triggered stimulus. Stimulus required borrowing. Borrowing expanded debt markets, and expanding debt markets supported financial institutions, which meant crises became opportunities, not just threats. Periods of instability justified new lending programs, new rescue packages, new guarantees, designed to prevent collapse, but each adding another layer of obligation to the system. Debt didn't just survive crises. It grew stronger because of them. Failed fixes, austerity, inflation, and bailouts. Over the decades, policymakers tried different solutions. Cut spending, raise taxes, restructure obligations, inflate away liabilities. But each fix came with consequences. Austerity slowed growth. Tax hikes reduced investment. Inflation eroded purchasing power. Bailouts socialized losses while privatizing gains. In every case, the system adjusted, but the underlying dependence on debt remained intact, because removing it would mean dismantling the very mechanism that financed modern economies. Debt had become too central to fail. Modern parallels, the pattern repeats today. Global debt, across governments, corporations, and households has surpassed hundreds of trillions of dollars. Interest payments now consume significant portions of national budgets. Central banks hold massive quantities of sovereign bonds. Financial markets react instantly to changes in borrowing costs. Entire economic strategies revolve around managing credit conditions. The pattern is familiar. Growth depends on borrowing. Borrowing depends on confidence. Confidence depends on stability. And stability often requires intervention, which creates more borrowing. It's a loop that feeds itself, an engine that powers itself. Empires sustained not by conquest but by obligation. 3 takeaways: debt shifted from temporary financing tool to permanent governance mechanism. Monetary systems evolved from commodity-backed assets to future-based promises. Financial stability increasingly depends on maintaining, not reducing, systemic debt. A final thought: empires once expanded by acquiring land. Now, influence can expand through balance sheets. But if power is built on promises, what happens when those promises outgrow the future meant to repay them? Call to action: if you found this breakdown useful, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the hidden mechanics of money, power, and global finance, because understanding the system is the first step to seeing where it might be headed next.